The scent of scorched molasses clung to the kitchen rafters long after the summer syrups had cooled, and Eulalie knew every knot in the blackened beams above her head as well as she knew the scars on her own knuckles. Dawn was a gray seam being stitched open along the Pearl River bottoms when she slid the oven door with her hip and drew out a pan of Johnny cakes, steam lifting like breath from sleeping mouths. She timed the count under her breath, 1 to 7 for the flip of the iron, 8 to 12 for the knife edge, because numbers steadied her when the house staggered about in its tantrums. Beyond the back door, mist drifted across the kitchen yard, softening the cruelty of the hitching post. But morning always found its way to the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Martha, the head housekeeper, would not be down for another half hour. The Belfield family sat their breakfast later on Tuesdays, and Eulalie could hear only the horses shifting in the stable and the river talking to the cattails. That quiet, that half hour, was the only time she allowed her eyes to move like fingers searching for a hidden seam. She set the pan on the scarred table, lifted the lid of the dry goods bin, and slid 2 folded slips from beneath the sack of salt. To anyone else, they would have been recipe notes, measurements, oven times, peculiarities of Belfield's uneven brick heat, but she had written them in a hand so small it lodged like a splinter in the paper, numbers braided with letters until only she could taste the scents. She had taught herself the letters with a child's primer a white girl named Delphine had left under the pawpaw tree one spring. The primer had been damp and half muddied, its cloth spine coming apart, but Eulalie had taken to it like a mouth starved for sweetness. She memorized each page, then burned it slowly in the stove over the course of a week, a leaf at a time, so no one would find more than a smudge. What remained was inside her, a drawer of shapes and their sounds, a way to uncoil the white folks' world and read it like a river. She wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the first slip. Wind from the east at sundown 2 days running, a note about how the attic in the big house caught drafts through the scuttle at the peak, the overseer's habit of spending Wednesday nights at Dogwood Ben's card table where the whiskey made him mean and death. A map sketched with words and reckonings lay under her eyes, the kind of map that did not need pen and ink because it had been walked. She knew the distance between kitchens by the smell of their smoke when the air lay heavy, and she knew who carried coals in a lidded bucket from Ember Mound across the fence. How Mercy's youngest had a cough that worsened near the dye house. How the carpenter at Rosemound kept scrap shavings in a burlap sack under his bench. Mercy was the only person who knew about the drawer inside Eulalie's mind, and Mercy treated it as if it were a baby's head, delicate, precious, never to be struck. She was older than anything Eulalie could name, a seamstress whose fingers moved like moths at dusk. Mercy's stitchery hummed through Belfield's rooms, curtains, cuffs, collars, and in its humming, Eulalie heard messages hum back. An extra running stitch where there should have been a backstitch, meaning walk careful. A green thread hidden where everything showed white, meaning river tonight. They never spoke of it. It lived like breath between them. Eulalie folded the slips and slid them into the seam of her apron, between lining and shell, where a neat tuck kept them from crinkling when she moved. She felt their weight the way a river stone weighs almost nothing in the water, but pulls down the whole pocket once you rise to land. One slip was meant for Ludi at Rosemound's laundry, the other for Jonah at Dogwood's Ben's stable. She'd counted the days, counted the moon slices, counted the temper of men who fancied themselves made in the image of something high, and found that the count always returned to the same thing. At some point, a body must move its feet. The first time the thought had come to her, Eulalie was kneeling in the ash pit beneath the stove, raking down the coals so they would hold their heat through the noon lull. The thought was not a clean sentence. It was heat on the wrist and the reek of rendered tallow and the gritty sound of a poker dragging across brick. It was news that had come up the river in scraps, rebellions crushed in places with names she had learned to pronounce in her mouth like cherries. Charleston, New Orleans, Nat Turner and the Woods. Always the same, a lash, a sail, a noose, and then white mouths praying for peace while they loaded rifles. Eulalie did not want to die in a gun's grammar. She wanted the way water moves, patient, muscular, always finding a seam. She found seams in the house that morning the same way she always did, by moving as if she had no mind at all. She cracked eggs, sliced bacon thin, scalded the rim of the coffee pot with a kettle's hiss to chase the bitterness. When Martha came in wiping her wrists on a drying cloth, Eulalie mumbled, "Mornin'," and took the meat fork from the peg. Martha's eyes rested on the Johnny cakes and then on Eulalie half a second longer than habit. She did that now and then, like a person listening for something in another room. But Martha turned away, humming a hymn under her breath, and Eulalie felt the world release its clutch a little. The breakfast bell sent the house into a commotion. Eulalie moved between the stove and the sideboard, between the porridge and the platters, keeping to the edges of the rooms where a woman could be both seen and unseen. That was a skill as practical as any hammer, the art of moving through a white family's hunger without leaving a mark on their sense of themselves. She learned to set the coffee where Mr. Belfield's hand could find it without looking, to anticipate how Mrs. Belfield's temper grew tender when her sugar fell short, to read the children's footsteps on the staircase the way some folks read weather. After the dining room had swallowed the clatter and closed its mouth, Eulalie slipped out the back. She passed the wash yard, where steam rose from the kettles like shades, and the smokehouse, where slabs of pork hung and sweated brine. Sparrows hopped among the pecan leaves. The hitching post cast a hard shadow on the dusty ground. The morning was warming toward itself. Eulalie walked as if she were going to draw water, the slip in her apron pressed like an oath against her thigh. Ludi's door at Rose Mound's laundry was never truly shut. The lookout was a child with a ribbon in her hair and a nose for trouble. Eulalie, however, chose a day when the child had been sent to scour pots at the overseer's kitchen, and she entered with a broom in her hand and her head down. Ludi looked up from a tub, her sleeves rolled high and her arms red with lye. To anyone else they spoke only of soap cakes and grease stains. To Eulalie, Ludi's glance flicked once toward the window's bottom left corner, where a tiny twist of blue thread had been tucked in the casing the week before. Blue meant water, bottom left meant weight. "2 shirts with blood," Eulalie said, setting the broom aside. The boy from the quarters fell on the bucksaw. "I'll soak 'em in cold," Ludi said, and her voice thinned at the edges the way it did when other ears might be near. "Where's the other?" Eulalie let her hand slip to the apron seam. She did not withdraw the paper. Instead, she palmed a scrap of muslin with a single green stitch running like a river through the weft. Ludi's eyes softened the way a late September sun does, not warm yet, but promising. "Tomorrow's the fair at the river," Eulalie said. "If you want pecans, the tree's dropping heavy down by the ferry." "Mercy tell you that?" "I saw it myself." Eulalie picked up the broom. "Wind from the east," she added, barely moving her lips. Ludi nodded as if someone had asked her about starch. On the way back to Belfield, Eulalie stopped at the smokehouse and lifted the lid of the salt barrel, slipping her hand beneath the cloth that covered the pork. She left no paper. She left only the faintest run of beeswax from the candle stump she kept in her pocket, drawn along the barrel's rim. Jonah was a man who looked for shine. He saw it in harness leather and wheels and horses' coats. He would see it on the salt barrel and send his eyes searching. There, in the crack of the barn door at Dogwood Bend, he would find the echo of that wax in a notch she had rubbed into the wood 2 days ago, and his hands would know to follow the path of her attention until they met the place where Mercy, with her moth-like fingers, had hidden the real slip, under the hem of a tablecloth whose corner had been turned the wrong way around. Nothing about this was quick. The river did not move quick. It moved forever. Eulalie understood the difference between haste and speed. One tripped itself trying to be a race. The other was a stride a person could hold until the next bend in the world. She had not begun with fire. She had begun with breath. Marrow-month heat lay on them that summer like a damp quilt. Men swelled like ticks in their pride and shouted at the sky for being blue. Women cinched their stays and held their composure like a glass set toward the edge of a table. Eulalie watched the white folks practice their authority as if it were an instrument they had to keep tuned. She watched their mornings, prayers, sugar in the coffee, ledgers.
She watched their afternoons, naps, horseback rides, indolence. She watched their nights, whiskey, cards, soft-footed visits to rooms not their wives. With Mercy, she studied the house. The big house had lungs, the flues, the stairwells, the attic scuttle. It had arteries, the passage from kitchen to dining room, the corridor past the nursery, the back stairs by which Martha moved like an ordained presence to and fro. It had a beating heart, and that was where Mr. Belfield kept his desk with its blue-backed ledger. Eulalie had stood in that room only twice, behind Martha, a shadow to a shadow, and she had felt something ancient and cold inside herself awaken when she saw the columns of figures marching down those pages. What a lie, she had thought with a clarity that lit the inside of her skull. What a lie to pretend anyone could own the work of other people's breath. But uprisings with knives ended in rope. She knew that. She had seen rope. She had combed a child's hair while a man pulled his lure of righteousness over his face like a mask and marched to the yard with a cohort of cowards behind him. She had wiped blood from a banister. She had warmed milk for a woman who struck her with the same hand that reached for the glass. Eulalie was not the only one to know these things, but she was the one whose mind had taken them apart and set them back together until a picture appeared, a night when fire could become a wind that blew through 3 houses and laid them down. "Burnin's a cruel business," Mercy had said when Eulalie spoke in the dark, in a whisper that could have been a prayer. "So is livin'," Eulalie answered, and her voice did not shake. "So is dyin' on their terms." Mercy laid a hand on her hair and made the sign she always made, invisible almost, an embroidery stitch on the air. "You burn a house, you burn a story. Make sure yours is the one left to tell." So Eulalie told herself 2 stories at once while she worked. One was the Belfield story, with its china and its malice and its comprehension of itself as orderly. The other was Eulalie's story, laid like a quilt beneath the first, piece by piece, until warmth appeared where there had been only cold intention. She put away bacon grease in a jar as faithfully as any white woman saved for soap, except her jar would not wash a body, it would feed a wick. She saved lint from the carding room. She tucked splinters of fat wood in places no one thought to sweep. She carried grief like another kindling, the boy who had been sold, the woman whose baby died because the doctor could not be bothered to come on a Sunday. She kept time with the almanac. She pretended to study recipes while her eyes tucked away the moon's phase. She walked in the evening and counted the turns of the wind by the smell of the river on it. She listened for what the night birds said about weather. A blackbird tattled east wind on Monday night, and she smiled into the dark, small and tight, because the east wind pulled smoke away from the quarters and drove it toward the big house roofs where cedar shingles lay like dry tongues. One afternoon, Mr. Belfield came into the kitchen and asked for lemonade. His boots tracked dust. His temper wore its Sunday coat. He said, "Make it sharp, not like Martha's. She puts sugar in everything." He laughed at his own jest, and when Eulalie handed him the glass, the pause between her fingers and his was so brief it would not have registered as time on a clock. He did not thank her. He took the drink and turned away. She watched the line of his neck where the hair grew soft and mean. She stored the image like a prickle in her thumb.
That night, she lay on her pallet, listening to the house settle. The weight of what she meant to do lay on her chest like a sleeping cat. She did not think of the furniture or the portraits or the clock that rang the hours as if a bell in its own church. She thought of the people. She thought of the woman who took the laundry in her arms like a baby and had to hand it over to a mistress who called her lazy. She thought of the boy who shed hair because the overseer made him carry lime. She thought of Jonah, who could whisper a horse to quiet and had a smile that warmed like ashes do when the poker stirs them. She thought of Mercy, whose needle song was the sound of patience over centuries. When Eulalie fell asleep, she dreamed of water. It was a dream she'd had since she had learned her letters, that every letter was a little canal,
and the canals ran together until the whole world became a map of water one could navigate by touch alone. In the morning, the memory of that dream sat in her as if she had drunk a glass of milk and now felt strong. The county fair made the riverbanks busy with white folks buying jars of pickles. That was the day Eulalie had chosen. The overseers would be at the judging pens, the men would be busy with their boasts, women would be showing one another their peaches. The big house would expect a lighter supper. Cold meats, bread, pies set out in a fan, and the family would not notice if the lamp oil had been topped off an hour earlier than usual. Men who believed themselves the center of gravity did not notice the attention of the smallest star. In the week before, Eulalie scheduled errands she had no authority to schedule. Martha thought it was her own idea to send Eulalie to Dogwood Ben's kitchen for a borrowed cake tin. Eulalie had adjusted her conversations until the idea occurred to Martha's head, ready-made. It was a mind trick she had learned from watching the house. If you set a thing down often enough in the same place, even if nobody sees you, later on folks swear they put it there themselves. The morning she carried the cake tin home, she passed Jonah at the stable yard and placed her palm flat against the warm barrel of a chestnut mare, as if admiring the shine. Her palm left a crescent of wax so thin it would be gone by noon, but by then Jonah would have caught the glint and followed it down to where the sawdust had been scuffed into a small half-circle, leading, if one had a map like Eulalie's, to a post with a knot that hid a twist of cotton lint tied with green thread. Wednesday, east wind, after the hearths are cleared. Mercy came to Belfield under the pretense of fitting a waistcoat for Mr. Belfield. Eulalie met her in the parlor with the tray of pens and arranged herself so that their reflections in the mirror could be read by anyone who knew which stitch to look at. Mercy pricked her own finger. The drop of blood would have been nothing in any other house, but here it marked a place in the cloth that later her moth-like hands would unpick and replace with something else entirely. "You sure?" Mercy murmured, with her lips hardly moving. "We're sure," Eulalie said. She meant herself and the river and the wind and the months she had lived with the thought as if it were a candle cupped in both hands. "Children first, elders second. The rest follow the creek path as soon as you see the first roof catch." "You watch the chimneys," Mercy said. "A flame like a man's temper climbs straight up till it meets its own arrogance in the attic. Then it spreads." Eulalie swallowed. What Mercy knew about fire had come from a life of learning what not to do near white men's temper. "I'll watch," she said. On the morning of the fair, Eulalie woke before the rooster. She rationed her breath the way some ration sugar. In the kitchen, she packed the picnic baskets with cold chicken and biscuits, arranged the jars of pickles so that Mrs. Belfield would preen to show the judges her bounty, and checked the lamp oil, filling the heavy glass lamps as she always did. Only this time she dabbed a whisper of fat at the base of a wick where it met the brass collar, a thing no one would see. She laid a layer of tinder, carding lint, and shaved slivers of fat wood. Deep inside the ash box so that the ash was stirred later, the tinder would be stirred too. She folded a newsprint from last week, an advertisement for a runaway man, and set it between 2 layers of kindling in the hearth in the parlor, as if merely tidying, as always. When the carriages rolled down the drive, Mrs. Belfield's laugh bobbed under the cedar branches like something that did not belong to anyone alive. Eulalie watched the house exhale. The girls would be showing their ribbons. Mr. Belfield would be inspecting sheep and pretending that constituted labor. Martha would be walking a pace behind the mistress, her face set like the lid of a jar that is sealed too tight. The young son, Andrew, had a cold. He would stay with the tutor. Eulalie made up a tray for the boy, and as she took it up the back stairs, she noticed in herself the steady hum that comes when a body has already stepped across a line. The boy's room smelled of ink and wintergreen. The tutor, a thin man from Kentucky, nodded to Eulalie and returned to his book. "Leave the tea there," he said, not looking up. Andrew coughed. Eulalie set the tray and adjusted the curtain to let in less light. The boy's coughing had a hollow sound. She thought of the children of her own people, how their coughs had been fed lie and smoke and fear. She spoke gently. "Eat while it's warm." She had no plans for the boy to die. She would not be fire the way a man was fire. She would be fire the way lightning is fire, a law of the sky answerable to something larger than any single house.
She had arranged that afternoon's chores like a pattern of squares in a quilt. By the time she set the dough to rise for the evening's bread, the sun had tilted toward the pecan pasture, and the east wind, faithful as a psalm, ran its fingers under the eaves. Eulalie went over the count one more time. Ludi, at Rose Mound, would be placing tinder in the cold hearths while the lady of the house preened at the fair. Jonah would be clearing the stalls and making certain the lanterns hung just so on their pegs, wicks trimmed, chimneys polished with vinegar until they shone. Mercy would be winding down her day's stitching in Belfield's sewing room and carrying a basket no one would inspect. When the lamps were lit and the hearth stirred back to life, their careful adjustments would mean that the smallest gesture, an extra tightening of a wick, a careless toss of a hot coal onto what looked like old ash, would teach flame to put its mouth to wood instead of settling for the obedient dance it was allowed. At sunset, a sheet of birds unrolled itself from the sycamores and furled again on the far bank. Eulalie listened. The river spoke in a voice she had known since she was a child, low, persuasive, always suggesting the next turn could be kinder than this one. She lit the kitchen lamps at the usual time, neither early nor late, her hands as calm as if they were buttering bread. She set one lamp on the warming shelf near the parlor door, trimmed just a hair higher than custom, and turned away as though distracted by Martha calling for more plates. "Eulalie," Martha said, "the master will want his cigar brought up when he returns. Cut the end so the draw is smooth. He complains otherwise." "I know how he likes it," Eulalie said, and the words were a simple braid, one strand of fear, one of contempt, one of a patient kind of pity she did not care to examine. She left the parlor door ajar so the draft would pull the lamp toward the room. The family returned earlier than she had hoped. It made the house noisy in a way that confused her careful measures. Girls squealed over ribbons. Mr. Belfield regretted winners. Mrs. Belfield complained. Martha moved faster than a woman should at that hour after such a day. Eulalie felt the plan flex like a tree trunk in wind. Plans did that. They could either snap or sing. She adjusted. She removed one lamp sooner than she had intended and set another one closer to a curtain than she would have dared on any other night. She ladled stew without spilling as she did so. She kept both stories in her head. After supper, Mr. Belfield went to his study to write letters. The east wind lifted the curtains. Andrew's cough had quieted. He slept. The tutor had gone to his own quarters. Mrs. Belfield and the girls took up their sewing in the parlor, a ring of pale faces in lamplight. Eulalie stood in the doorway, waiting for the coffee tray. She watched the wick whisper to the chimney glass. She watched the brass collar glow with warmth. The faintest tremor ran up her arm, not fear, but awareness, the way a doe's muscle trembles just before it springs. She did not light anything. She did not strike a match. She did not act like a man in a story who needs to announce himself to his own courage. She acted like a woman who knows houses. She waited for the moment every house offers, when its carelessness meets its vanity.
The lamplight stretched toward the curtain, blinked, and touched it. The darkening, the size of a thumbprint appeared. It would have been nothing if anyone were looking. No one looked. Eulalie stepped forward, calm as a maid concerned for dust. She lifted the coffee pot and set it on the tray to balance the cups. When she turned, she let the tray's edge kiss the table so that it rattled. Mrs. Belfield's head came up. "Do be careful," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Eulalie answered. And in that moment, the thumbprint of dark on the curtain found sweetness in itself and began to spread. She carried the tray to the study. Mr. Belfield did not look up. His pen moved as if it had a life apart from his hand. The room smelled of ink and old smoke. Eulalie set the coffee where he always reached without seeing. She turned to go, and in turning, saw through the study door the faintest rise of light in the parlor doorway, a color that was not the color of any lamp. She heard the river in her blood. She moved as if to fetch the sugar. She did not fetch it. She went to the back stairs and lifted her skirts a fraction to move. The kitchen lay at the foot of the stairs like a loyal dog, ready to answer any name she gave it. Mercy was at the table with a basket of mending. She met Eulalie's eyes, and with the smallest shift of her chin, asked the question of a lifetime. Eulalie nodded once. Mercy stood. "I'll take the bread to the spring house," she said, in a voice as ordinary as Monday. "It's too warm here." "Take the little ones first," Eulalie answered, though there were no little ones in the kitchen at that moment. Mercy understood. She slipped through the back door and into the dark where the creek path began. The parlor murmured, then rose. A woman's voice said, "What is that smell?" Then another voice shaped the word everyone avoids until it becomes unavoidable. "Fire!" Even then, Eulalie did not let herself run. She moved with the gravity of a task being done correctly. In the kitchen, she lifted the ash drawer as if to clear it for morning, jostling the tinder she had laid until it met a coal that had waked itself to a contrary brightness. She set the drawer back with care and took up the water bucket, empty, and walked toward the pump at the back steps. Outside, she filled it halfway and spilled it as if in panic when she turned. "Mercy!" she called into the dark, and any ear would have heard fear. The truth was steadier than fear. She was speaking to the part of the night that was listening, the part that would carry words along the creek and under the trees and tell the people waiting that it had begun. Behind her, in the parlor, a sheet of flame drew its own breath and fed a mouth of flame. Eulalie heard the sharp, high sound of a mistress losing the part of herself that believed the house obeyed her. The girl screamed in counterpoint. Martha's voice drove through the tumult like a ship's prow. "Water! Water!" Eulalie let herself obey. She ran into the parlor with the bucket that had only a little in it and flung that little on a flame that had already learned to climb. The water sizzled. Steam rose like a ghost. The flame shook itself and went on with its living. "Fool!" Eulalie cried Mrs. Belfield. "Do something!" Eulalie looked into the woman's face and felt a clarity so bright it frightened her. She lifted the bucket and ran for the kitchen again. She kept running, past the pump this time, past the smokehouse, past the sycamores, into the path that the creek kept secret for those who knew it. The night took her and gave her back. The east wind walked with her, hand in hand. At the bend where the paths split, one spurred toward the quarters, one toward the low crossing, Mercy waited with 3 children and an old man whose back had doubled with years. Eulalie counted heads. Mercy's eyes asked 1,000 questions and received the same answer for each: keep moving. Eulalie took the smallest child and balanced her on her hip the way she would have carried a sack of flour, but with a tenderness flour never asks for. "Follow the creek," she said. "To the old ferry. Ludi will be there. Jonah will be there. No fires, no lamps. Hands on the person in front of you. If you trip, you fall quiet. If you cry without sound." "You coming?" Mercy's voice was thread through cloth. "I'll bring the next," Eulalie said. She would not leave the house yet. She had not finished with it. When she turned back toward Belfield, she felt the heat before she saw the light. Fire rewrote distance. A place that had been 100 paces away became a different planet. The parlor windows shone a furious orange, and sparks lifted into the night like 1,000 bees leaving a hollow tree. The roof lay against the stars with its cedar tongue out, tasting its last summer. Eulalie's eyes stung, but she did not blink enough to miss the shadow of a man stumbling onto the porch and coughing. Mr. Belfield flailed toward the yard, his hair blown back, his face streaked with ash. For an instant he seemed to turn in the direction of the quarters, and Eulalie's heart stopped and then hit its drum so hard she could not hear the night birds. But a fall of burning curtain at the door drove him back into his own smoke. He fell to his knees and crawled like a child. Eulalie stood very still and let the night decide whose breath it would keep. She went to the quarters, not into them. "Martha!" She called on to the path that led to the back house where Martha slept when the mistress allowed sleep. Martha emerged with a shawl and a face set to an effort that would not listen to complication. "The study! Buckets! The well!" Martha shouted. "The buckets are dry," Eulalie said, which was almost true. There were buckets, and there was a well, but no bucket that could outpace a wind already teaching itself to climb the stairs. "Take the cook's boy and go to the creek," Eulalie said to Martha. "I'll fetch the ones from the far sheds." Martha stared, then obeyed, because even in a house like Belfield's, the person whose voice makes sense becomes the person you follow. Eulalie used that the way a woman uses a good knife, sharp side where it does its work, back of the blade where it guides. She moved along the quarters quickly, not entering, pulling faces out of shadow with a hissed, "Come," and a pressed finger to her lips, hooking people into the path the way a net hooks fish. "Creek," she said. "Old ferry." She did not say fire. The fire could announce itself. Her task was to name the safety and send bodies in that direction. When she had gathered half a dozen, she turned them to the path and went back once more for an old woman with a limp who had been too long at her pallet. She lifted her with a strength that surprised them both. The woman weighed less than a sack of cottonseed and more than a life should weigh at the end. "Hold on," Eulalie said, and the woman did, light as a bird with bones like twigs. From the yard a crash sounded, followed by a long sound that might have been a man's cry or a beam giving way. Eulalie did not look. She kept her eyes on the ground in front of her so her feet would serve her well. The air carried a taste of resin and old varnish. The house's years were going up the way a book does when a single word set on fire runs its flame along a sentence, and then a paragraph, and then the rest of the book. At the creek crossing, the first group she had sent were on their knees, drinking like cattle. Mercy counted heads with her hands, touching each brow, each cheek in intimate census. Jonah emerged from the laurel with 2 boys and a girl and a mule moving softly behind them. His eyes found Eulalie. He did not smile. This was not a smiling night, but he lifted his chin the way a man does when a plan meets itself. "The others?" Eulalie asked. "Ludi is behind," Jonah said. His voice made every name sound like a door opening. "Take them," Eulalie said, and her words were for the night as much as for Jonah. "Follow the creek to the old ferry. Then the canebrake. Stay low." She turned to Mercy. "If anyone falls, the ones in front keep moving. I'll bring the back." She did not wait for agreement. She did not ask the knight's permission. She returned up the path until the heat pressed her forward like a hand between her shoulder blades, then cut across the pasture toward the fence that separated Belfield from Rosemound. Her breath was a bellows. Sweat ran into her eyes and tasted of salt and ash. She ran hunched, a posture the world had taught her, and the ground under her feet remembered her and did not betray her ankles. The fence was a line of blame between 2 houses, but as she slid under it, she thought of the fence as a single thing, a measuring stick for distance across which a plan had been stretched. Rosemound's creek path lay darker than Belfield's, and Eulalie paused to let her ears learn its grammar. She could not see the house from here. The intervening trees made a chapel out of the night, and the night said nothing. She moved forward, palms out, finding trunks and the smooth, cold faces of stones. The path widened. Then a glow presented itself, pale at first, licking the undersides of leaves with a strange daylight. When she came to the edge of Rosemound's yard, the glow sharpened to its true color. Ludi had done her work. A single curtain at the back parlor had found the language of heat and was telling its story to the wainscoting. Eulalie felt a gratitude so fierce it almost knocked her to her knees. She wanted to shout Ludi's name into the roar of it, but she swallowed the shout because plans did not feed on praise, they fed on movement. She slid along the shadow of the spring house and came to the laundry shed where Ludi sometimes slept when the mistress stayed up late with ladies and gossip. Ludi was not there. A bundle laid on the pallet, a shirt of a child, and a rag doll and a Bible that belonged to Ludi's mother. Eulalie lifted the Bible and tucked it under the pallet. Flame was no respecter of stories, but sometimes you put a thing in the earth and hope the earth remembers. She went to the back of the main house and pressed her hand to the warm clapboards. The house was relearning the fact that wood, too, had once been alive.
The scent of scorched molasses clung to the kitchen rafters long after the summer syrups had cooled, and Eulalie knew every knot in the blackened beams above her head as well as she knew the scars on her own knuckles. Dawn was a gray seam being stitched open along the Pearl River bottoms when she slid the oven door with her hip and drew out a pan of Johnny cakes, steam lifting like breath from sleeping mouths. She timed the count under her breath, 1 to 7 for the flip of the iron, 8 to 12 for the knife edge, because numbers steadied her when the house staggered about in its tantrums. Beyond the back door, mist drifted across the kitchen yard, softening the cruelty of the hitching post. But morning always found its way to the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Martha, the head housekeeper, would not be down for another half hour. The Belfield family sat their breakfast later on Tuesdays, and Eulalie could hear only the horses shifting in the stable and the river talking to the cattails. That quiet, that half hour, was the only time she allowed her eyes to move like fingers searching for a hidden seam. She set the pan on the scarred table, lifted the lid of the dry goods bin, and slid 2 folded slips from beneath the sack of salt. To anyone else, they would have been recipe notes, measurements, oven times, peculiarities of Belfield's uneven brick heat, but she had written them in a hand so small it lodged like a splinter in the paper, numbers braided with letters until only she could taste the scents. She had taught herself the letters with a child's primer a white girl named Delphine had left under the pawpaw tree one spring. The primer had been damp and half muddied, its cloth spine coming apart, but Eulalie had taken to it like a mouth starved for sweetness. She memorized each page, then burned it slowly in the stove over the course of a week, a leaf at a time, so no one would find more than a smudge. What remained was inside her, a drawer of shapes and their sounds, a way to uncoil the white folks' world and read it like a river. She wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the first slip. Wind from the east at sundown 2 days running, a note about how the attic in the big house caught drafts through the scuttle at the peak, the overseer's habit of spending Wednesday nights at Dogwood Ben's card table where the whiskey made him mean and death. A map sketched with words and reckonings lay under her eyes, the kind of map that did not need pen and ink because it had been walked. She knew the distance between kitchens by the smell of their smoke when the air lay heavy, and she knew who carried coals in a lidded bucket from Ember Mound across the fence. How Mercy's youngest had a cough that worsened near the dye house. How the carpenter at Rosemound kept scrap shavings in a burlap sack under his bench. Mercy was the only person who knew about the drawer inside Eulalie's mind, and Mercy treated it as if it were a baby's head, delicate, precious, never to be struck. She was older than anything Eulalie could name, a seamstress whose fingers moved like moths at dusk. Mercy's stitchery hummed through Belfield's rooms, curtains, cuffs, collars, and in its humming, Eulalie heard messages hum back. An extra running stitch where there should have been a backstitch, meaning walk careful. A green thread hidden where everything showed white, meaning river tonight. They never spoke of it. It lived like breath between them. Eulalie folded the slips and slid them into the seam of her apron, between lining and shell, where a neat tuck kept them from crinkling when she moved. She felt their weight the way a river stone weighs almost nothing in the water, but pulls down the whole pocket once you rise to land. One slip was meant for Ludi at Rosemound's laundry, the other for Jonah at Dogwood's Ben's stable.
She'd counted the days, counted the moon slices, counted the temper of men who fancied themselves made in the image of something high, and found that the count always returned to the same thing. At some point, a body must move its feet. The first time the thought had come to her, Eulalie was kneeling in the ash pit beneath the stove, raking down the coals so they would hold their heat through the noon lull. The thought was not a clean sentence. It was heat on the wrist and the reek of rendered tallow and the gritty sound of a poker dragging across brick. It was news that had come up the river in scraps, rebellions crushed in places with names she had learned to pronounce in her mouth like cherries. Charleston, New Orleans, Nat Turner and the Woods. Always the same. A lash, a sail, a noose, and then white mouths praying for peace while they loaded rifles. Eulalie did not want to die in a gun's grammar. She wanted the way water moves, patient, muscular, always finding a seam. She found seams in the house that morning the same way she always did, by moving as if she had no mind at all. She cracked eggs, sliced bacon thin, scalded the rim of the coffee pot with a kettle's hiss to chase the bitterness. When Martha came in wiping her wrists on a drying cloth, Eulalie mumbled, "Mornin'," and took the meat fork from the peg. Martha's eyes rested on the Johnny cakes and then on Eulalie half a second longer than habit. She did that now and then, like a person listening for something in another room. But Martha turned away, humming a hymn under her breath, and Eulalie felt the world release its clutch a little.
"Ludi," Eulalie called softly, but only the river answered. She moved toward the quarters. A boy sped past her in the dark and nearly knocked her over. The boy's eyes were white and his breath wheezed. "Creek," Eulalie said, catching his forearm. "You know the way?" He nodded hard enough to move her hand. "Take the ones you find," she said. "Hands on hands. No fire, no crying." He went. Two women stood at the threshold of a cabin, their hands empty and their bodies full of indecision. Eulalie filled them with the direction. "Follow the creek," she said. "Mercy's waiting." She said Mercy's name like a lantern. The wind bent the sycamore and tossed sparks along the path. Eulalie covered her head with her apron and kept moving. Although she and Ludi had made no appointment beyond the blue thread signal and the mention of pecans, she felt the absence of Ludi like an ache. Then Ludi came, silent as a cat, with a child on one hip and a basket on the other. Her eyes were strange with purpose, her mouth set toward a line that had nothing to do with white women's sewing. "You see it?" Ludi asked, and Eulalie knew she meant not the fire, but the next fire. "I see it," Eulalie said. Dogwood Bend lay beyond the cane field and the low bridge, where the river ran like a friendly dog through a narrow channel. The overseer there played cards on Wednesday nights. The men drank enough to be their own ember heaps. No one watched the lantern hooks. Jonah would have done his part, trimming wicks and nudging oil with a hidden tenderness that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with accuracy. If the wind held, Dogwood Bend's stable hay would go to air as easy as a gasp, and the rest would follow. "Go," Eulalie said to Ludi. "Creek, ferry, Mercy." "You?" Ludi asked. "Dogwood," Eulalie said. They touched hands once, a press like the closing of a book. Eulalie ran the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then, ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Bend's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly. Cards slapped a table. She could not see Jonah, but she felt him the way a person feels a warmth left by another person's body in a chair. She circled the stable to the leeward side where the lantern hooks hung from a beam at the height of a tall man's shoulder. She did not touch anything.
She looked. Wicks trimmed neat, oil level just a hair past prudence. Wick collars shined with vinegar so the flame would see itself and try to grow to meet its own reflection. Hay underfoot had been forked clean to wait until morning, but a fingertip's worth of loose chaff lay along the sill where a man's indifference couldn't be bothered to brush it aside. Eulalie stood in the song of all of it and let time do what it does when it's been prepared for. The first sound was not fire. It was a horse breathing in its sleep and shifting a hind leg, the iron shoe ringing a small note against wood. Then, like a change in a choir, the lantern's whisper of flame lengthened. It reached down to taste its own shadow and found the chaff. Eulalie felt the exact instant when heat became hunger. She moved away, slow at first, so her body wouldn't cry out to anyone watching that it was running, then quick around the corner, then into the cane again where she dropped to a crouch and watched the mouth of the stable door without breath. A minute is a century when you have lit a fuse you didn't touch. A laugh broke from the card room in the big house. A dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure. Then it came again, thicker, and announced itself to the pine boards like a preacher who finally finds his sermon. Eulalie rose. She did not stay to savor. She ran along the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Ben's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly, cards slapped a table, a dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure. Then it came again, thicker, and announced itself to the pine boards like a preacher who finally finds his sermon. Eulalie rose. She did not stay to savor. She ran along the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Ben's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly, cards slapped a table, a dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure. Then it came again, thicker, and announced itself to the pine boards like a preacher who finally finds his sermon. Eulalie rose. She did not stay to savor. She ran along the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Ben's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly, cards slapped a table, a dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure. Then it came again, thicker, and announced itself to the pine boards like a preacher who finally finds his sermon. Eulalie rose. She did not stay to savor. She ran along the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Ben's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly. Cards slapped a table. A dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure. Then it came again, thicker, and announced itself to the pine boards like a preacher who finally finds his sermon. Eulalie rose. She did not stay to savor. She ran along the long side of the field and cut through the cane where a narrow fox path ran. Cane hissed at her shoulders. The path dipped and rose, and the river's voice changed from persuasion to insistence. She put her foot on the low bridge and felt it ripple under her weight. The night smelled of water and pitch and the faint milk breath of calves. Then ahead, a square of yellow presented itself, the lantern window in Dogwood Ben's stable, steady, innocent. She stopped and listened. Somewhere a man laughed too loudly. Cards slapped a table. A dog barked with sleepy warning and then yawned it away. The lantern's pane took on a smudge the color of honey. A thin brush of smoke wandered out the door, sniffed at the night, and went back in as if unsure.
"You," Martha said to Eulalie. It might have been an accusation. It might have been an absolution. It might have been the utterance of a fact meeting its own shape. "You." Eulalie did not answer. She put water to Martha's lips and waited while the older woman's chest reassembled its ribs around breath. When Martha could swallow, Eulalie slid an arm under her shoulders and drew her into the cane where the rest lay quiet as stones. The night went on. Fire is a greedy clock. It takes hours and calls them minutes, takes minutes and calls them the whole span of a human life. Eulalie kept count against that lie. She measured time by how long it took a cricket to sing a song, by the number of heartbeats between one gust and the next, by the way a child's hand unclenched once sleep came. She sent Jonah twice along the break's edge to listen for any human sound that did not belong to them. He returned with only the news that owls hunted and frogs spoke their foolish wisdom. When the first blue seeped into the east, the timid kind that hides its own courage, Eulalie rose. She stepped out of the break and stood where the river could see her and report her position to God if God cared to listen. Smoke lay in the sycamores. The air tasted of pennies. Where Belfield had been, a low bright seam showed and then went dull. Where Rosemound had preened itself under ladies' hats, a black shape hunched like a burnt loaf. Dogwood Ben's stable, she could not see, but the smell of singed hair and iron and chaff mixed told her what she needed to know. She went back to the people and spoke to their fear first, because fear thinks itself the only language until someone else speaks. "We stay until the sun is higher," she said, "and then we move into the cane and the cypress. No one goes back, no one goes to see. A house is not a person. If anyone we love is not here, we say their names softly and we walk. We become the river." Somewhere in the assembly, a woman began to list names under her breath. Mercy took the list from her with a hush and wove it into her own wordless hum.
Jonah stood with his hand on a tree as if he were holding it up. Martha sat with her knees apart and her hands hanging and stared at nothing. Eulalie felt a hand find hers. It was the smallest hand there. She closed her fingers, and the hand closed back. The sun lifted itself inch by inch, like a hard-won truth. Morning birds pretended the world had always been as it was. Eulalie watched the light find faces. Ash made everyone kin. She took up a stick and drew a line in the damp ground. "East," she said. "River bends here. There's a cypress stand with knees like a field of little men. Past that a slough. We keep to the slough's left edge and come out near the old mission. No one goes to the road. We are cane and shadow and water until we are not." She looked at Jonah. She said, "You take the first group. Children and elders. Mercy goes with you. Martha." She hesitated. The older woman lifted her eyes at last. "Say it," Martha said, not quite with anger and not quite without it. "You go with Jonah," Eulalie said. "You know how to make people mind you." Martha snorted, a small ember of her old self. "That I do." Eulalie watched them arrange themselves. The people moved with a grace she had not known could appear in so short a time. Suffering had taught them to be careful. Now purpose taught them to be exact. She waited until the first party slid into the cane and was gone as if the night had taken them and made them its own at last. Then she turned to the remainder, a dozen souls whose eyes looked to her in a way that would have been dangerous if she had been a man. She felt the pull of it and allowed it to anchor her instead of dragging her down. "We go," she said again, and this time the words included her. They went. The slough was a long, narrow dream smelling of mud and wild onion. Cypress knees rose like the bones of drowned men. Dragonflies skated. The ground gave way under a foot and then found itself again. Eulalie moved at the front and set the pace by her own breath, which she kept long and even so that the ones behind her could borrow it. They did not talk. They said everything they needed in the way they placed their feet in the footprints she left. The sun climbed to a place where it could not see them, and the air inside the cane thickened the way a room does when too many secrets have been told inside it. By mid-morning, Eulalie called a halt in a hollow where the plants arched overhead and made a coolness. She counted. Again a number came up short. Again a mouth tried to cry and did not because it had learned. Eulalie made water orders with a tilt of her chin, handed out the last of the Johnny cakes from her apron pocket, and took none for herself. She sat with her back against a cypress whose bark had the texture of a worn book, and closed her eyes. Behind her lids the houses burned again, but this time the flames were lines of script written in the primer's hand, and for the first time since she had touched that damp, discarded book under the pawpaw tree, she thought of the shape of her own name. No one had ever written it except her own hand in ash and water on a skillet lid once, and then wiped it away. She pressed her tongue to her teeth as if to test the letters there. Eulalie. She would like, she realized with a small start, to see those letters laid down where someone else could read them when she was gone. A rustle in the cane tightened every back. Jonah appeared ghost-like, his face streaked with creek water. He set down a gourd. He set the first ones in a pocket by the mission. Shade enough. Mercy's with them. Martha, too. "Any sign?" Eulalie asked.
"Only the sky," Jonah said. He did not mean weather. He meant that the sky keeps what men shout at it and sometimes shouts back. They moved again then, under that sky. The old mission rose from the cane like a warning finger. Brick, roof fallen in, door long since taken to repair some white man's chicken coop. The bell was gone. Vines had erased the name. Once it had been a place where a pale man in a black coat told black people that their souls had a house that could not be sold. Eulalie felt a wave of something like contempt and then something like tenderness.
People had brought their Sundays here, and so some holiness clung to the bricks like mist. Mercy emerged from a shadow and beckoned. The elders and children lay in a horseshoe of shade, a geometry as ancient as rest. Martha sat with her back to a wall and her head bowed. Eulalie knelt, took the older woman's hand, and pressed it once. Martha did not mind her face for meaning. She let the contact be what it was, a stitch. The noon got itself done without relief. Nothing was decided at noon, Eulalie thought. Mornings decide, evenings decide. Noon simply burns. She used burning to cauterize fear. When the angle of the sun at last suggested a new story, she rose and pulled Jonah aside. "We need to know," she said. He shook his head slow. "Know what?" "Who hunts?" she said. "Where they hunt, whether the river holds men on horses on its banks or whether it holds only its water." "I'll go," Jonah said. "I'll go," Eulalie answered, and felt that for the first time since she had set the tinder, her voice had a quaver in it. Jonah heard it. He placed his hand on the small of her back as if to steady a lamp. "We'll both go," he said. "Two eyes see two things." They went together along a deer run that bled out onto a low dirt road used more by wagons than by fancy carriages. Eulalie went to ground and flattened herself where the cane's edge made dapple. Jonah lay a body's length to her right. The road lay empty for 3 minutes, 5, 7. Then hoofbeats scarred the quiet. Eulalie chewed the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron. 3 riders came, their hats slung back, their coats flapping like tired flags. 2 were men from Belfield, neighbors more than masters, the kind whose names you do not say because you have to say them too often anyway. The 3rd were a deputy's star. They did not dismount. They did not look at the cane as if anything important could be in it. Their faces held the outrage of men whose house has told them the truth about themselves for the first time and who do not care for the lesson. "Spreads from room to room like all hell was waiting in the wood," one said. Another cursed Jonah by name as if fire had consulted him first. The deputy kept his mouth less busy, and Eulalie watched that one. Men who kept their mouths shut chose longer roads. He spat into the dust. "We'll see by evening. If anyone used the creek, the ferry's rope is cut." Eulalie's throat closed. She had not thought about the rope's message. Men remembered ropes. Men invented righteousness out of hemp. She thought of the children and how their hands had trailed along that braided line, gathering its itch into their palms, and her body went cold sweat at once. Jonah's hand moved toward hers, and she let it find her knuckles for the space of a heartbeat. And then they withdrew their hands because the hoofbeats brought dust, and dust brought coughing, and coughing brought notice. When the men passed, Eulalie did not rise. She stayed until the world resumed its insects. Then she and Jonah slid backwards like water into Cain and returned to the mission ruins where Mercy waited with a count and a question. We move at sundown. We keep to the slough. We take the long way. We do not touch a rope. Martha's eyes opened for that. "They'll be watching the roads," she said. It wasn't advice. It was a grief making itself useful. Sundown was slower than it had any right to be. The light stuck to the world as if unwilling to make a choice, and every minute Eulalie's heart drummed the news into her ribs that the minutes were deciding with or without her. Finally, shadow made a sheet she could draw over them. They moved. The children were brave in the way children are when they are told a story with clear rules. Eulalie made the rules with the confidence of someone who could not afford to hesitate. Mercy was a shadow stitched to her side. Jonah walked at the rear, his body a screen for the ones who stumbled. They had gone a mile when the night made a noise that was not river or frog or owl. It was a man coughing when he tried to keep quiet. Then it was another man not bothering. Then the long scrape of a branch against a horse's flank. Eulalie's breath folded itself in half and then in half again as if to hide. She pressed her palm to the ground. The ground told her the truth. Wait near. Down, she whispered, and the whisper traveled along bodies like a prayer passed from pew to pew. They lay among the cypress knees while the riders passed so close Eulalie could smell their saddle soap. The deputy from earlier spoke. They went to the break, he said. You know how I know? How? Another man asked. Because where else would rats go? And he said it, and the chuckle that followed made Eulalie's hands curled into fists around nothing. They passed. A long time later, after the night had unwrinkled itself, Eulalie rose on her elbows. She did not weep. She had trained her tears to come only to water that deserved them. She looked at Mercy. Mercy nodded, and with the same steady economy with which she set stitches, she led the next 10 steps. Eulalie followed a half pace, her body learning how to be behind, her mind keeping the map in front. When the old mission was 2 bends behind them and the slough widened to a place where the water put its shoulder against the low bank and made a quiet, they stopped. Eulalie sat very still. She could feel the story pressing forward like a crowd at a door. 3 houses had burned, children had drunk from the creek, men had passed with stars pinned to their chests, the night had learned a new language. There was more to do. The plan was not finished, and yet the air changed, and in the change Eulalie felt the hairs on her forearms rise as if a storm were gathering, though the sky was clean. She turned her head a fraction. Someone stood on the far bank. A shape, a hat in a hand, a coat darker than the dark. A voice came, low, careful, and aimed only at her in a way she knew immediately and rejected with her whole blood. Eulalie.
The river kept its own counsel. It took the deputy's voice and laid it flat on the water so that it had to travel like a skiff, slow, audible to whomever the current allowed. Eulalie did not move. The reeds hushed like anxious women. Jonah's hand shifted near her knee, ready to pull her back, ready to spring forward, then stilled when he felt the air tighten around her name. Eulalie, the deputy said again, softer. I don't want to bring men into that break. Before anyone else could breathe too loud, Eulalie did the smallest, most consequential thing she had done all night. She lowered her eyelids for the span of a heartbeat and opened them again as if she were agreeing with herself. Then she stood, not high enough to show her waist, only enough to let the deputy see the shape of a woman where cane met water. What you want, she said, keeping her voice at the low register where water hears and men do not, is the thing you can't have. He did not startle. You've done enough, he said. There are children in there. There were children in there when those houses stood. No one came then. I came, the deputy said. I came when I could. Eulalie's mouth drew into a line that felt like a stitch pulled tight. She had seen him before. He had been the kind of white man who wore quiet the way other men wore guns. He had stood aside when cruelty paraded, not clapping, not stopping it. She had witnessed the way he looked at Jonah's hands when Jonah set a saddle straight, a flash of something like respect, like envy, like fear. Quiet men could make themselves into anything later and claim it had always been so. Eulalie did not believe in later. You burn a house, the deputy said, choosing his words. You burn a story. You know that. I'm burning a lie.
The story will live." He took off his hat. The gesture, meant to be read as honor, looked like surrender to his own confusion. "They'll hang whoever they can catch," he said, and the words were not threat, but prediction. "I can say I found you on the road, that you were running from it, that you weren't the spark." "You think I want your parable?" Eulalie said. The wind lifted her hair. Behind her, Mercy's whisper traveled, hands on hands. No one moved. The deputy's shoulders slumped a measure, then squared as if he put on a coat he did not like. "By morning, there will be dogs. I can't hold men from their rage." "Then you'll have to hold yourself," Eulalie said, and because she felt the night change shape, the way a quilt shifts when a sleeper turns, she let her eyes go past him, over his shoulder, to the thin ribbon of smoke still unspooling above the tree line. He followed her gaze a fraction. That fraction was the width of a life. Eulalie sank back into the cane without a sound. When the deputy looked again, the bank was a bank, empty of women and names. He waited, hat in his mangled hand, then replaced it, then walked the line of the river 60 paces before choosing the wrong path into the trees. The water carried the news of his boots away. Jonah exhaled, a long, private prayer. "He knows your name," Jonah said. "He doesn't know my story," Eulalie answered, "and that's the only thing that stays." They moved again, deeper into the break, until the slough bent south and the cypress roots rose like a congregation's knees. The children slept in pairs draped over their elders like shawls. The elders sat with their backs against roots worn smooth by flood years and memory. Martha stitched open a bag of dried apples with her teeth and put pieces in small hands without waking their mouths to cry. Martha, stripped down to the muscle of herself, began to count in a whisper, the inventory of souls, the tally a woman keeps when a ledger might save a life. "Before we go on," Eulalie said, soft, "tell us where you're from in the comments, and subscribe if you want more of these stories of courage. 2 more great stories are next, and tomorrow I have a special one for you." She said it into the hush as if speaking to a circle of faces by lamplight, and some of the women smiled at the oddity of it, not because they knew what it meant, but because the cadence sounded like hope. When the east went from ashen to bruised, the first dog barked. It was a long way off. The second dog was closer. The third belonged to a man who took pride in the way his hounds answered his temper, and it bayed with a lust that tasted of iron. The brake tightened around them. Breath became a trade good, precious. "We split," Eulalie said, "not because we're afraid, but because a river that forks reaches more places." She set her palm on the ground, and the ground told her there was a sand ridge to the west that a wagon could not climb and a man on a horse would avoid. "Mercy, take 5 families along the ridge, low and slow. Martha, you take the ones can walk quick, loop east to the mission, and then to the old mill. Jonah?" She looked at him, and the part of herself that was not strategy, not map, not river, answered to the sight of him. "You're with me." Martha's mouth twitched. "You're splitting yourself in 2? "I'm letting the night decide which of me it wants," Eulalie said, and Martha's twitch became a grudging nod. They divided with the soundlessness of people used to leaving in the middle of things. Mercy's group slipped into the thicket that led to the ridge. Martha's moved like a draft of shadow toward the east, her voice a narrow lane keeping them between ditches. Eulalie and Jonah gathered the last souls, 3 men with eyes like flint, 2 women with their babies tied against their ribs, an old man who carried a violin with no strings, because memory had tuned it to a different kind of song. The dogs talked to one another. Men answered. The world shifted from the privacy of night into the commerce of pursuit. Eulalie set their pace at a steady trudge that eats distances without announcing itself as flight. Branches wrote scratches on their forearms. The slough widened and offered itself as a mirror in a trap. At a place where a fallen log made a low bridge, the old man with the violin paused, bent, and placed his hand flat on the log as if to greet an old friend. "Go on," Eulalie told him, and he did. And the violin under his arm looked for all the world like a sleeping child. It was a boy, skinny, eyes too big, who heard the first clink. Not chain, not spur, metal on glass. He tugged at her apron. She crouched, cheek to his whisper. "Bottles," he breathed.
Lanterns, men stepping carefully. The reed bed on the far side of the slough shivered. Eulalie pointed to a patch of water fringe thick with duckweed and put her finger to her lips. She slid into it like a snake. The boy followed, then the two women, then the flint-eyed men, last of all Jonah, who took one breath deep enough to hold a life and then went under to his chin, only his eyes above the duckweed, his palms spread to keep the water's skin from telling tales. The men came into view by halves, the lower legs first, then the thigh, then the glint of a belt buckle. The smell arrived before the faces: whiskey, sweat, gun oil, a bitter tang of fear trying to read as righteousness. The deputy was not with them. Eulalie counted 4. She marked where each man's boot sank a little deeper, where another favored his left because the right knee had been ruined by a horse long ago. She watched the last man. He had the kind of eyes that checked corners, checked shadows, checked a man's pockets and a woman's mouth. He checked the water. Eulalie flattened her breath to the width of a leaf. "Dogs say they went this way," one man muttered. "Dogs are chasing ghosts. Whole county smells of smoke." "Hold the light up," the watcher said, and the lantern climbed, drew a wet gold line along the duckweed, showed nothing but the patient backs of cypress knees and the midges spinning in tiny frenzy. When they moved on, Eulalie didn't. She held the absence of motion for a count of 60, then another. Her grandmother had taught her that stillness is the weapon white men never look for in a woman's hands. When the night accepted the men elsewhere, she rose an inch, then another, and shook the weed from her shoulders. Jonah emerged without a sound, water running off his jaw like resolve. The boy grinned and then remembered himself and put the grin away for later. They crept in the slack left by the men's departure, a shadow using shadow's wake. A barred owl asked who and answered itself. The wind had lost interest in choosing sides and merely moved. Behind them, far, too far, something in the direction of Belfield groaned and fell at last. A house's last joist, Eulalie thought, giving in to gravity and truth. By afternoon, they reached the old mill where the creek narrowed and ran itself thin over boards gray as bone. Moss hung like forgotten lace. The wheel had long since frozen to a certain hour. Eulalie made the quiet sign with her fingers, and the group lowered onto their haunches. From the loft above the mill's broken mouth came the smallest sound, Mercy's sewing hum. The relief that went through the group was a ripple, not a wave, but it refreshed like water. Mercy had gathered Martha's party there, and 2 more faces Eulalie had not expected. Ludi, soot-streaked, holding a girl whose hair had been singed at the ends into stubborn curls, and the deputy's thin tutor, clothes torn, spectacles gone. He rose when Eulalie entered as if she were a magistrate. "I couldn't keep him there. The boy, Andrew. He saw the flames. His mouth worked. He woke when the parlor went. I took him to the spring house. They were drunk on the road and I thought, 'Where is he?' Martha said. Each word a board slammed onto trestles. 'He's gone with Miss Caroline.' He meant Mrs. Belfield's eldest. She ran with him to the pastor's house. I came here because I thought you might kill me if I stayed." He blinked as if surprised by the exactness of his own speech. "No one's killing you," Mercy said, "but you will pull your weight if weight's to be pulled." The tutor nodded too quickly. He had the look of a man who believed virtue could be acquired by standing near it. Eulalie wanted to scoff. She did not. A body could be made useful,
that was enough for now. They fell into the mill's hush and made a plan around the rotten beams. 2 days in the cane for the elders and children, then downriver by night to the bend where the long-armed cypress made a cathedral shade and the bank wore the shape of an old camp. From there, further, marshland, shacks no one remembers, boats that belong to men who do not say their names in daylight. Eulalie had never seen the place, but the river carried gossip better than any woman, and told her a story of a stand of live oaks where drums were buried and dug up when the moon was right. "We'll need a thing white men trust," Jonah said. "We'll need papers." His mouth shaped the word with distaste. "Something to show a patroller who only knows how to read a stamp." The tutor blanched and then reddened. I can write a pass for laundry, for delivering linens, for a child with fever." "We'll need better than that," Martha said. "We'll need the sheriff's name in a hand that looks like his." "I've seen it," the tutor whispered. "In the ledger." Eulalie looked at Mercy. Mercy's eyes flicked once, a green stitch where there should be white. "We teach him the hum," meaning they would sing the sheriff's hand onto paper the way they sang stitches into cloth until the lines began to lie for them instead of against them. They worked. The mill's loft became a school where no one learned to look at their feet. Eulalie drilled the children in silence games. Who can breathe like moss? Who can step like a spider? Mercy and Martha took turns at the door, measuring the distance between a twig snapping and a man's approach. Jonah taught the boys to read the moods of water. The tutor wrote and rewrote. He practiced the sheriff's name until it moved with a swagger he could not inhabit in his own bones. At dusk, a new sound entered, a distant drumming. Not war, not church, a cadence that carries messages on the marrow. Eulalie went to the sill and closed her eyes to listen with more of her than ears. The rhythm said 3 things: friend, wait, smoke. She opened her eyes and found Ludi at her elbow, face upturned to the same air. "They're sending word," Ludi said. "Downriver."
"How fast will it run?" "As fast as us," Ludi said, and for the first time since they left Belfield, she smiled, the kind of smile a woman makes when a baby's cough eases at last. They moved at second dark, when the frogs canceled the dogs. The passes had been tucked into the folds of aprons, sewn into hat bands, rolled and hidden in the hollow of a violin's neck. Papers that read like permission to men who preferred paper to truth. They took 2 skiffs from under the mill wheel, boats that had not seen water since a flood year, and patched their seams with a mixture of tallow and beeswax Eulalie had saved as faithfully as hymns. When the river received the skiffs, it did so without splash, as if consenting to the weight of the plan. They poled along the bank, under the ceiling of cypress, water humming a low note against wood. Once dogs bayed on the far side, then lost interest. Once men called to one another in a tone that made even the river curl its lip. They passed a bend where the moon wrote brief letters on the current, and Eulalie felt the night gallop under them like a horse. She stood in the skiff's bow, hands loose, hair damp, and let herself be the thing she had told the people to become: river. At the live oaks, shadow became architecture. The stand was older than lies. The trunks were wide enough to hide 10 men behind each. The ground under them was ridged where drums had been buried and dug, until the tune of the place transmitted itself through the soles of the feet. There were people there. They stepped from behind bark the color of moonlight on water. Faces familiar and strange at once. The faces of fugitives who had expected to be alone forever and now found themselves the shape of a group. A woman with hair like iron filings stuck to a magnet came forward and touched Eulalie's wrists with both hands. "You brought the wind," she said. "I brought the truth," Eulalie answered. "The wind came because it likes the truth." They collapsed into food and sleeping without the ceremony of introductions. The drums told the story to those who did not yet have it.
3 houses in one night, a river that learned new names, a woman who said no to a sentence in a ledger. At dawn, Eulalie stood under the lowest limb and tried to imagine waking into a life without someone to demand the price of her breath. Her imagination, which had been trained to map other people's needs, did not yet have the reach. She gave it time. They needed a day for the elders to uncurl their backs. They needed a day for the children to relearn the taste of quiet that doesn't mean danger. They needed a day for Jonah to sit with Eulalie with his shoulder pressed to the same bark and say nothing. That day did not belong to them. At mid-morning, a boy from the Oaks came with a message in his chest. Riders on the road, dogs crossing the shallows at the downstream ford, a deputy who had the look of a man late to his own judgment. "We can go to the marsh," the iron-haired woman said. "A week under that sky and you forget men have feet." "We can also go to the city," said a man with hands scarred by rope. "There are mouths in New Orleans that swallow men like them and don't burp." Eulalie listened to the suggestions lay themselves down in her mind and made the habit she had trained into herself. She thought in stories. Marsh was a story of hiding. City was a story of dispersing. There was also a third story, the one the river had held back from her until now, because it is a dangerous thing to offer a woman choices she can love. She said, "We can go back." The word startled even her. "Back?" Mercy asked softly, as if tasting a spice she had not expected. "We burned houses," Eulalie said, "but the ledgers live in men's pockets and in their heads. There are papers that make lies look like law. If we unwrite those too, the story we burned won't be copied somewhere else in ink." She turned to the tutor. His face went to water. "I can take you to the courthouse," he said without being asked. "I know where the clerk keeps the land deeds. I know where the sheriff keeps bonds." Martha snorted. "You know a lot for a man who couldn't keep a child from running toward a fire." "I know how to feel shame," he answered, surprising them all, perhaps himself most of all. Jonah looked at Eulalie. "What do you want?" She answered without looking away. "I want to take the counting from their hands." She felt the rightness in it. Not revenge, not flame, not spectacle. Arithmetic. Names unbound from debt, bodies unhitched from ink. They argued because a plan worth breath is worth argument. Mercy stitched possibilities like hymns, turning them up and letting them down until the fit seemed right. Ludi wanted to go to the city and drag the ledgers into a street where a drum could stomp their leaves to pulp. Martha wanted to go back to the ruins and sit in the ash until the county learned to walk on its knees. The iron-haired woman wanted to live long enough to see her hair go white without having to call any man master. Eulalie wanted all of it and knew she could not have everything at once. She said, "Half go. Children and eldest to the marsh. Mercy with them. Ludi takes the city road with those that trust her feet. Martha," Eulalie paused, "you come with me." Martha's eyebrows climbed. "You'll be needing someone to tell you when you're about to be a fool," she said, which was yes. Jonah didn't wait to be told. "I said I was with you," he said, making it a vow that tied no rope around her wrist. They broke into thirds like a braid undone, only to be woven again. The marsh-browned group moved like the tide when it slips a bank, no ripple, no apology. Ludi's city party wore borrowed bonnets and slouched the way servants are trained to slouch. The tutor went with them to write passes so convincing they made even Martha's mouth purse in reluctant respect. Eulalie's piece of the plan was the smallest, the sharpest. Eulalie, Jonah, Martha, and a boy whose hands could pick a lock with a fishbone. They waited for rain. The sky obliged in the sullen way of August, hard, brief, enough to give roads a skin and leave men blinking. They walked into town on feet that had been made into shadows. The courthouse wore its brick like arrogance wears a coat. White men with business moved in and out with the nervous efficiency of people who think their order has been natural since Genesis. The sheriff's star winked from a doorway where a laughing mouth swallowed the end of a cigar. Jonah circled the stable. Martha counted windows and found the ones that would open to a knife. The boy with the fishbone looked at the clerk's side door, looked at Eulalie, and looked again as if the door was a puzzle he had loved since morning. Eulalie stood under the eaves across the street and watched rain bead on laws. They went in at noon because noon burns and men are clumsy when they're hot. The tutor had been right. The clerk kept the deeds in oak cases along the wall as if they were psalms. The sheriff's bonds and arrest warrants lived in a drawer that stuck and had to be cajoled. Eulalie had observed men enough to know that the drawer's hesitancy would buy them minutes. Jonah took the back hall where a mop leaned with the weariness of every woman who ever leaned. Martha walked down the center like she owned the floor and dared anyone to remember that she did not. The boy knelt by the lock and fetted his fishbone. The door opened the way a man's mouth opens for a lie. They did not steal, they rewrote. Mercy's hum had taught the tutor well. His hand moved like the sheriff's would have if the sheriff had wanted truth. Eulalie took the deeds that named Belfield and Rosemound and Dogwood Bend and flipped them. She found the enslaved names listed in the mean little inventory columns, male, female, age, teeth, and wrote those onto new papers that said release, said manumission, said debt satisfied, words that come to nothing in a court if a judge wishes them to, but words that, when dropped into the stream of record, can widen into law and a generation if tended. She wrote the names large. She wrote Eulalie once in the margin of a memo no man would read and then rubbed it out with her thumb. The thrill of seeing it was enough. Martha took the arrest warrants and fed them to an iron stove in the clerk's break room where coffee went to die. "This one's for Jonah," she said, as a paper curled. "And this one's for a boy who could ride like the devil and got beat for it. And this one's for a woman the mistress called thief. All she stole was a glance out the window." Fire did this work without spectacle. It ate and made no boast.
They were nearly done when a shadow fell over the doorway. The deputy, hat in hand again. The rain had stuck his shirt to his back. He did not draw his pistol. He looked at the stove, at the drawers, at Eulalie's hand poised over a deed with a pen that had not hesitated all day. He shut the door behind him with the care of a man setting a sleeping child down. "You can't put this back," he said. "I'm not trying to," Eulalie answered. His gaze slid to Jonah, to Martha, to the boy who held the fishbone like a talisman. Then it returned to Eulalie. "You're making me choose in a room with no witnesses," he said. "That's unkind." "Kindness has had its turn," Martha said, not looking up from the stove. "It lost." The deputy took a breath as if he would laugh and found he didn't have it in him. "If I walk away," he said, "they'll say I didn't see. If I stay, I'll have to do a thing I'll hear in my sleep." "Then walk," Jonah said. He said it like the thing it was, a mercy that is also a sentence. The deputy's jaw worked. He put his hat back on. He did not move. "You came to the river and said my name like you owned it. I'm giving yours back to you. You decide what to make it mean." He looked at her as if a man could learn a language in a minute. Then he left. The door clicked behind him. The rain wrote long dashes across the windows. Eulalie's hand shook for the first time. She set the pen down. "We go," she said. They fled the way truth does when it has done its work, without hurry that looks like guilt, without slowness that invites hands. The boy locked the door behind them and tucked the fishbone into his hair like a feather. The street involved itself with its own business and let them pass. At the Live Oaks that night, the drum slowed to a grateful heart. The Marsh party had made it to their beds of reeds. Ludi had sent word that a woman with a bonnet taller than Sense had taken 3 children into her cart and driven them past a patrol because she liked the way the youngest boy said thank you with his eyes. The tutor had stayed in the city to be a man between ledgers and lives. Martha sat under the low limb and let her hands rest like hands. Eulalie lay under the sky. It had not changed, and yet everything under it had. Jonah's breath was a slow tide beside her. Mercy's hum grew distant as sleep invited it to make a different song. The night cooled. The cicadas decided they had said enough. From far down river, a single dog barked and then thought better of it. Eulalie counted names until counting became dreaming. When waking came, it came in the shape of a voice that was not a dream. Eulalie, it said, and for the first time since she had stood with water at her knees and told a man no, she did not know if the voice came with a hand or a rope. Her eyes opened into a dawn so new it was almost cruel. A silhouette stood between the trees. A hat, a coat, a star catching the first light. The deputy, alone. He held nothing in his hands. He held everything in his face. I walked and I came back, he said. Eulalie rose. Around her the oaks awoke like old gods. Jonah stood into himself without reaching for anything he did not need. Mercy's hand found Martha's and stitched the 2 of them together for whatever came next. The deputy took 1 step forward and set something down on the ground between them. A leather book, blue-backed, edges gilt, a ledger. He said, I brought you this. And the river, which had known so many stories and their costs, held its breath. Eulalie looked not at the book, but at his hands. They were empty now, but their history lay in them, and hers lay in hers, and between the 2 the morning waited to be told which way to bend. The deputy lifted his eyes to Eulalie's. He said, Tell me what to do. And for a long heartbeat, she allowed herself the dangerous, holy possibility that the story would obey her. Then the dogs bayed again, close, too close, and men's voices tangled with the day's first birdsong. The live oaks gathered their shadow as if pulling on armor. Jonah's fingers brushed Eulalie's. Mercy's hum turned into something with a tempo. Martha stood, and her face shed 20 years of obedience like old bark. Eulalie lay under the sky. It had not changed, and yet everything under it had. Jonah's breath was a slow tide beside her. Mercy's hum grew distant as sleep invited it to make a different song. The night cooled. The cicadas decided they had said enough. From far down river, a single dog barked and then thought better of it.